Welcome back to Crimson Ed Talks. I'm your host, Jamie, and we're joined once again by the incredible Amay Aggarwal. A lot of folks are curious about the world of big tech. And, it's funny I call Uber big tech because I remember back in 2016 when Uber was going through its rapid scale up phase and was probably the world's most famous and aggressive company at achieving kind of worldwide growth. But certainly these days, with the scale of its engineering team, you probably could say it's certainly big tech with, I think, 100 billion market cap, maybe more these days. So, what was it like, I guess, working in the world of big tech? What were the pros? What were the cons? Would you do it all over again? And what advice would you give to a younger May, now an undergrad, who's curious about, considering charting that path in big tech?
I had a wonderful experience in big tech. So it was a great place for me to start my career. I was part of an associate product manager program or APM program, which is a 9-person program. It's rotational, so you get to work on different teams. The biggest value of that big tech experience was actually the learning and mentorship that I received through that program. So getting to work very closely with my manager, you're not just like assigned tasks, but they're really invested in your learning. They tell you exactly, these are the things that you should be thinking about, how you should be thinking about problems in the space. And I think it made me way, way better at running a team, understanding problems, setting a vision, setting goals. These are all important skills for me now as I transition to a founder journey. So yeah, I think overall the big pros of the big tech experience is you just get to work with a ton of people. You get a ton of different opinions. You get a lot of mentorship, advice, guidance, and that's really valuable early on in the career. I'd say one of the cons is just the pace at which things move. And I think, start to face that more and more, especially the more senior you go, there's more, people involved in decision-making processes. And I think now that I'm kind of on the outside, I'm seeing, well, I don't have to make a whole pitch for why I want to do certain things or why I believe certain things. I can just go out, implement them, and then, move very, very fast. And so I think there's always a balance of like earlier stage is a lot faster, later stage, there's other sort of pros that you have to face. I would say my advice would be try both as much as you can, right? Try working at a startup as an internship, try working in big tech as an internship, see how you like it. And then I think that's going to give you really good information coming out of college as to whether you want to go work in big tech or whether you want to work in something smaller.
But I always love the quote, and I'm going to massacre it in this moment, but it's something about how you always wonder, how does a startup beat a huge big tech company in a certain niche, sort of David versus Goliath? But it's ultimately not David versus Goliath. It's like a small splinter team of highly motivated folks versus a chill product manager crew who are sort of sitting there in the middle of this big tech land, at their nice cafeteria, working 40 hours. I'm just kidding, and there's that funny jewel between these two groups.
Yeah.
And I think a lot about, firms like Xero that were able to sort of crack into like large scale, small business accounting, for example, and, make some inroads challenging folks like Intuit, QuickBooks. And, when you look inside these organizations, you feel a lot more happy being on the entrepreneur side of the table, just thinking about all the kind of slow decision making that almost has to take place because there are so many stakeholders. There's sort of no magic way to get through it all. Maybe unless you're Elon Musk, he seems to rip through it. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think a lot of it comes from leadership, right? What the pace that they set, how much they work, how they make decisions, how they sort of delegate decision making down versus like have a very regulated process. I think the bigger the companies get, that was all natural, and you kind of have to face that, which is totally fair. For example, Uber operates in like hundreds of different countries, and is dealing with thousands of drivers and millions of users. And so you can't just easily make a change, right? And which you can do as a startup. You can test very quickly. At Uber, everything needs to go through regulatory approval. Everything needs to be tested, A/B tested to make sure it's not having any unseen degradations on other parts of the business, which I think definitely makes sense at that scale. But as a startup, we can try those changes and see how customers respond and actually gather that qualitative feedback as well as the quantitative feedback, which I think is a really good skill set to develop too.
This, I guess, naturally brings us to the next stage of your adventure. You've rocked it at Stanford, then at Uber for actually a good stint of time, a good 3.5 years, if I remember correctly. And then following that, you went through Y Combinator, and now you're building your own company. So let's start with Y Combinator. What was that experience like? A lot of folks now, I was actually chatting to a guy last night, and he was saying, Y Combinator has become so big, is it almost too big? And so, I want to hear the nuts and bolts. How useful is it? Was it transformative? Was it impactful? How would you describe the experience? What were some highlights and some lowlights of that 6-week crunch time?
So I applied to Y Combinator after leaving my job and eventually ended up getting in. And so applied with an initial idea. You're definitely not attached to that idea that you apply with. Most people end up changing and iterating over time as they continue learning, talking to customers. And a lot of YC's mantra is make something people want. And I think that covers two things. One, can you make something? Can you actually build a product? And then the second part is, do people actually want what you're building, and are they going to be willing to eventually pay for it? Right. So I think kind of keeping that mentality in mind throughout the summer was the most useful thing. In terms of the actual nuts and bolts, So it is a pretty large cohort now. And so there's 250 companies and roughly 500 people, but they still do maintain that small aspect of it. So you're matched with a group partner that you meet with every 2 weeks. And then you also assign in specific groups within YC. So there's 4 groups, each have 60 companies or so in it. And that's actually the people that you meet on a very, very frequent cadence. Very useful to build alongside these people. You have mutual accountability. You set weekly or 2 weekly goals with each person, and then you kind of have to share them and share your progress. And that public accountability actually gets you to really, get your ducks in a row and figure out, okay, what exactly do we need to build in the next 2 weeks to actually achieve these goals. There's also an amazing alumni community that you can both learn from. So you have successful founders like Brian Chesky from Airbnb come back and talk, share some of their early stage journey and the mistakes that they made so that you don't want to repeat them yourself. And the other really useful alumni aspect is actually being able to sell to some of them, right? They're really good early adopters of the technology that you're building, and they want to help you out as well. So a lot of them, you can actually work with and say, hey, we're solving a problem that we anticipate you have. They'll respond to you. They'll reach out to you. And that really helps you get your business off the ground. And I think it's a really, really valuable network, both in terms of alumni as well as the mentorship that you get day to day.
Well said. And, a lot of folks, I think, I see it recently actually with, critiques around Ivy League schools and certainly critiques around Y Combinator. But I think that ultimately when you go through these places, you just see, man, the advantage you have rolling through and having the mentors, the advice, the network all around you in this compressed, format is just so, so nuts. And certainly at Y Combinator, there's nothing else quite like it, where a student can leave Y Combinator and almost instantly raise a funding round, basically guaranteed, as long as they're sort of breathing, functioning, and they've got some PowerPoint slides. Maybe they don't even need the PowerPoint slides. So, I think they've certainly created a real engine that is very, very impressive.